Well, I want to welcome everybody. First and foremost, this is an awesome crowd. I want to thank everybody for coming out. My name is Farrah Foster, and it's my privilege to serve as the director of the museum. It is also my privilege to welcome you. This is our first evening with the curator, and if you know anything about the museum, we don't actually have a curator. So there's some irony in that. It's just a catchy title. When we started this, we called it Coffee with the Curator, because we were doing these in the morning. And we had a special opportunity to have a special guest, and it just happened that their schedule was so full, we decided to try an evening event, and I'm very happy to see it's worked out pretty well. I also want to start this evening by thanking a few people. I know we usually thank people at the end. I prefer to thank people right up front. Paul Hooks has my absolutely undying devotion and gratitude. If it were not for Paul bringing Dia and James in a year ago, we wouldn't be here today. So I'm grateful for that introduction. I'm also grateful to a number of people who helped me tremendously, namely Linda and Frank Dobrovich for helping me with recipes for the night and for the kielbasa, and Virginia Lisco and her friends who helped bake the kolaches. There were a number of people that I read their writing. The late, great Garner Allen, our former director, Gina Seiden-Swartz, Glenn Moseteen, just a number of people that helped me put this presentation together without even knowing it. I'm going to give you just a quick little overview of the history of Slovak. So I have learned that this little catchphrase that I will not try to pronounce, I may share that, leave that for Dia in a minute, is translated the Friendly People of Slovak, or Slovaktown. And I found that to be completely true still. And just very grateful for the hospitality they've shown me. Our story begins in 1867 in Eastern Europe. At that time, we meet this gentleman. His name is Franz Joseph. He was the Emperor of Austria, but he became the King of Hungary. And he began forcing all of the people under his dominion to assume the cultures and the language of the Magyars, which were the predominant culture of Hungary at the time. And so, as people do, we don't really like to be told to not be who we are, and we start to move. So in 1875, we began seeing a large number of Slovakian immigrants come into the United States. So in addition to the forced assimilation under Franz Joseph, there was also some problems over there. There was increased poverty due to some widespread crop failures. There was cholera outbreak. Over the course of time, there was also forced military service. That was coming after the 20th century. But between 1879 and 1891, we see 80,000 immigrants coming from Eastern Europe. But by 1914, we had eclipsed 550,000. Now, 40,000 of those went home. But just to give you a little bit of a taste of how many people that was, the total population of Slovakia in 1890 was 2.5 million. So we're talking about 20% of the total population of that country at that time. And after they get here, the Slovakian people immediately started making an impact. So we see a newspaper, first a Slovakian newspaper that was printed in the U.S. was called the American Slovak newspaper, and there were 3 gentlemen who founded that, and their names will be seen throughout this presentation, but Jan Slavinsky, Julius Wolf, and Julius Oswald are these 3 gentlemen. And they are joined by this gentleman, whose name is Peter Robianek. Thank you for my translator. So, Mr. Robianek, there's a quote in here, and I used a lot of the information that was in the Slovak Colonial Society diary for this, but they had a quote that described him that said that he came to the newspaper in 1889 and gave a strictly patriotic spirit to the paper. He was extremely minded towards the betterment of his people. So this gentleman was born the same year that Franz Joseph came into power in Hungary in 1867. I don't know exactly when he came to the U.S., but he began studying at the Cleveland Seminary. And he quickly realized that he could do more for the Slovakian immigrants if, quote, not burdened by clerical restraints. So this gentleman leaves the seminary and he goes to work at the paper at some point. He was not only a journalist, but he eventually became their editor. And he was very entrepreneurial. So within a few years, he also founded the National Slovak Society in 1890. So lasting impact, this organization is still in existence. So if you are of Slovakian heritage and you would like to check that out, there's the website, nsslife.org. So how do we get from these guys starting a paper to the Arkansas Grand Prairie? Well, the U.S. government began advertising land at favorable prices after the end of the American Civil War. And this caught the attention of several of these folks. Colonizing farming communities among the Slovakian immigrants had been something that they had all wished to do. They wanted to preserve their culture, but they also wanted to be able to provide for their families in a way that didn't involve the coal mines of Pennsylvania, the steel mines of Ohio, Illinois, etc. So when they got here, they were doing some pretty seriously difficult work, dangerous situations, and they began to dream of owning land. Not a lot of hilly terrain for sheep raising, like there had been in their home country, but they do start looking around. So Mr. Wolfe begins attempting to colonize farmers in 1876, but he was hindered by finding people who were willing to invest $10 for exploration purposes. Our friend, and I'm just going to go with Peter, so I don't disrespect him, but Peter had announced in the newspaper in 1893 that he'd been granted land in Canada. And this is something he had carried in his heart for years as well, but he gave up the idea in Canada due to, as you can imagine, not so fun weather. Of course, I'm sure he didn't know about our summers here before he came down this way. But there was also a Father P. He wrote a number of articles promoting the establishment of Slovak communities in unity. And I found that theme to be prevalent in everything that the people did when they came over here. There was another priest, his name was George Franco. He wrote an article called Slovak Colonists in America. And in that he said, rapid assimilation into American pluralistic society was perceived as a threat to the culture and the religious identity of the immigrants. So obviously we like to be around people that we understand, we think alike, feels familiar. So these gentlemen, in the spring of 1894, they joined forces to form the Slovak Colonial Company. They wrote letters to real estate agents. They settled on one particular agent, Mr. Strom, who was a known relationship. He visited Peter's office with some frequency, but he worked for the Union Pacific Railroad. And they were also joined by two other gentlemen, Mr. Schwartz-Markovic and Mr. Hucher. Thank you. So these guys leave. They start in Pittsburgh at Peter's office. They depart by train, and then they meet the other gentlemen, Mr. Strom, Mr. Schustek, and Mr. Pouillet. This is a different mayor, Pouillet. They meet in Cincinnati. They jump on the train, and they are now going to venture across the country. Just to give you an idea of the close comradeship there, this is a photo taken in 1894 of the National Slovak Company. And in this photo, we have Daniel Schustek, we have Julius Oswald again, and we also have Peter. So it's really interesting to see these guys in print and all in a group. But they depart by train. They travel through St. Louis to Kansas City and then on to Ellis, Kansas. And just as a little side note, the entire country was in the midst of a 4-year drought at this time. It was extremely challenging. So what they found when they got to Kansas was pretty dismal. There were also notes from that same journal that said the winds were blowing, so the colonists almost went deaf, and they had to hold on so they wouldn't be blown out of the wagon. But they also said the skeletons of the dead animals were frightening to the settlers. So it was a pretty severe drought. They reversed course. They go back to St. Louis, and then they head south into Arkansas, where they found the land to be much more hospitable and also much more costly. So they arrive in Little Rock on June 17th, and they meet with a gentleman in Little Rock who was a Czech immigrant, Mr. Barecki. He had been in the country for about 40 years at this point. He was a tailor. They also meet with a gentleman named Van Deen, who was the administrator at the Agricultural Museum of the state of Arkansas. And they received advice from both of these gentlemen. Mr. Van Deen in particular advised them to go to the Ozarks, but then they also received advice to come visit the Stuttgart area. And then they meet a gentleman named John Kasurik, who's also a land agent. He lives in Hazen. From everything I can tell, very hospitable gentleman. But he, if some of you may have heard of Kasurik and Sons Hardware in Hazen, that building is also on the National Register of Historic Places. So he made a lasting impression on this community as well. So on June 19th, they go to Hazen. And just to give you a quick snapshot, so they leave Pittsburgh on June 8th. They arrive in Little Rock 9 days later on June 17th. And then they go to Hazen on June 19th. At this point, Mr. Kasurik escorts them to see various pieces of property. He takes them to farms that were owned by families by the name of Marks, Williams, Schwantners, various others. And we see in the journal, it says at approximately 4 p.m. that day, the group stopped for a meal, where we hear, quote, Mr. Wolf proved to be an excellent cook, thankfully for that. Mr. Robney, I'm going to master Peter delivered a soulful speech in honor of the birth of the Slovak community in Prairie County, Arkansas. And F. Pucher, J. E. Schwartz-Markovic, and J. Wolf spoke a few words, wishing monetary strength, spiritual progress, and glory to the Slovak nation. So they have carried their culture and their heart for their home with them. So they have now decided that the land between the LaGrue, or along the LaGrue between Fairmount and Stuttgart is going to be the colony for the Slovakian people. And they depart for home, and they begin devising a plan to sell this land. So there are various advertisements put into the Slovakian paper recruiting people to come. And on August 9th, so barely 2 months after their first trip, they return to Hazen with a group of investors. So their first excursion, the Slovak Colonial Society, and this will be much more noteworthy later, but they purchased 3,600 acres. 160 of those were set aside for the township, with the remaining land to be sold in 40, 50, and 60-acre plots. I thought it interesting that if you bought a 40-acre tract of land, you got a home site in town for no additional cost. So it's kind of there was a nice little add-on marketing ploy that they had there. The first excursion came in 1894. There were about 50 people on that excursion. 18 of those purchased land. Of those, 2 gentlemen, Andrew Kaczynski and Jan Olesak, were the first buyers. And it's also worthy to note that Daniel Sustek and Peter were also buyers prior to that excursion coming down. I think between them they had about 170 acres. So the second excursion comes 4 years later, but it only yields 7 more buyers. So it gives you an idea of how bleak it was at that time. And it was at this time that several more people actually bargained for land, but they ended up going back home so they could continue working in the mines and the mills to save enough money to be able to move and live on the Grand Prairie permanently. So it was during the third trip in 1894 that the first structure gets built. And this is kind of a community house of sorts. It was a two-story structure used as lodging for those visitors and temporary lodging for people as they were visiting or as they were building their permanent homes. I thought it was kind of cool. This comes up multiple times that the smaller rooms on the first floor were used as lodging and meeting space for the school, whereas the larger open space on the second floor was used for dancing. So they had more of a rec space up there. And there was a note in the journal also that said, under this building, we dug a hole where we put a tin casket in which we found the Slovak paper, in which is found the Slovak paper discussing the colonization of Slovaks to Arkansas. Also, we included Diary of a Slovak Colonial Society, which is a lot of the information I'm using tonight, a short story of Slovaks in America, sketch of the building by Daniel Shustek, and a booklet about the Slovak colony in Arkansas. So it would be interesting to know what happened to that tin box and where those documents ended up. That building was actually demolished in 1917 by a gentleman named Steve. His name, am I pronouncing that correctly? His name. He made room for his home as well as a new store there. And from the very beginning, like so many other communities, this was a community of faith. So Slovaktown was centered around 3 churches at one point. I didn't have a great deal of information about the Lutheran church, other than it was built in 1895, and I see nothing else. I did find a good bit of information about the third church that was built there, which was St. Mary's Russian Orthodox. That church was actually struck by lightning, burned in 1940. They built a brand new church to resemble the original church in 1942, but then just 10 years later, that building was moved to Stuttgart as a part of the St. Albans Episcopal Church here. So there was a great deal of information about one of the Russian priests who had at one time been here, but for the sake of time and some other things, I kind of left that out, but it is out there. It's very interesting. I did take a quote from the Stuttgart Daily Leader in May 1980 that talks about the former Slovak church serving as the Episcopalian Sunday school. And it talked about 4 families of the Russian Orthodox Church from Hungary, Austria-Hungary, settled at Slovak. And soon afterward, they began building their church. But he goes on to name 6 families. So I wasn't sure. I'm sure there's relationships in there. But it talks about John Pratelski, Alex Losak, George Medlick, Mike Fedler, Mike and Louis Krill. So I don't know if I know the Pratelski name is still around, but I don't know about those other families. And here's a little picture of the dedication day of the second church in 1942, and the church as it sits today at St. Albans. So it's still a vibrant part of our community, even though it's no longer in Slovak. And this photograph was actually taken inside that church. There's no date on it, but it does have Gina Simon-Schwartz's handwriting on the back, so I have every faith that her information is accurate. But it lists a Mr. Brasco on the left, Joe Pratelski, Mike Pratelski. The priest was actually from St. Louis. And then it says women from Little Rock and Pick. And I learned from Mr. Dubrovich last week that everybody has a nickname. So somebody in this crowd probably knows who Pick was. But in between those two, we see the one remaining church that has always been a part of that community. So between 1899 and 1900, we've seen Saints Cyril and Methodius Church be built, and it was one of the first in the U.S. to be dedicated to the patron saints of the Slavs. So it was originally a mission outreach of the congregation in Stuttgart, and the priest traveled out there once a month, but there were a number of people in the community that led those services on the other weeks. And after that original church was built, it began to lean to the point it had to be supported by poles, and then it caught fire also and was destroyed in 1914. So that's not so much a comment on what was going on with the churches, it is the fact that we're on the Grand Prairie, and there are prairie grasses, and prairie fires were kind of a big deal, as well as our storms. So they didn't have the same lightning protection and things that we have today. But we do see a new church get built in 1919. But we also, and we had dedication of a new parish hall in 1922, which I thought this was really cool. The governor attended that dedication. So we also noticed that this church had some physical challenges, and because of this big, beautiful bell tower, the weight of it caused that church to become a little unstable, and it had to be replaced in the 60s. And that's when we get this church. The first Mass was said there on Christmas Eve, 1961, and it is the only remaining church, and I would say probably the community hub of the Slovakian people there. So, just to give you a little snapshot on commerce, obviously agriculture is kind of a big deal in this part of the world. Prairie hay was abundant when the first settlers arrived. And I've heard different people say that you couldn't see above it if you were walking through it. It would be 5 and 6 feet tall in those days. There's an article written in 1911 called Immigrants in Industry, and it says most of the land in its natural state is clear of brush, and the whole region forms a natural pasture for cattle. The majority of the farmers are in the dairy business. Others sell corn and oats, while occasionally some sell at a little garden truck in neighboring towns. And I also noticed an article written about a gentleman named John Platkin, who it was said he left Slovakia on the run in 1908 at age 17. And by the time he gets here, he has invested $60 in a very crowded ship to get him here. And he ends up working for several years, 10-hour days, at $1.24 an hour. So he could save enough to buy 160 acres of land. But once he got here, he realized he could only survive if he could find a way to bale that prairie grass. And he was offered the chance to buy a motorized baler for $600, huge amount of money in those days. But he managed to pay that baler off and pay his men on the first field. So he was one of the early pioneers and had some interesting articles about him. But we also see dairying as a secondary importance there. Most of the farmers had between 15 and 40 cows, and there were a number of dairies that were in that community in the early 1900s. But we began to see prairie hay phasing out as we see wheat and corn becoming more popular very briefly. Because, as we all know, rice was introduced in that community in 1910, but it had become the crop of choice by 1916. Another big part of the commerce in the community was the general stores. So the general stores were not just a retail environment, they were a gathering place. And there were numerous notes and articles that several of the buildings also had second floor rooms for dancing. So there were several of articles talking about how the Slovakian culture was such a close culture that all of the socializing was done within that community. And there was a priest, and I can't remember exactly which one I read, who talked about how the Slovakian people were friendly with Americans, but they chose to really stay in their culture. And I think that's really the biggest part of why it's such a proud community now, but yet it's still such a welcoming community now. Those stores started in 1910. John Janesco and Mike Pratelski built the first one. They closed in 1918, and the building was eventually torn down in 67. In 1914, we have another store built by Stibsky. Mr. Stibsky went to war in 1917, never to return. His store was sold to John Sanders, who operated it until the 1930s. That store was torn down, rebuilt, and then sold to Stanley Serrani in 1930. And eventually, years later, after closing that business down, the building itself was moved to Hazen in 1958. There was another store built in 29 by Paul Lawrence, but Mr. Lawrence died soon after opening the store, and it was leased out to a variety of other proprietors over the course of its history. And then in 1933, we see the store built on the former site of the Dvorna by Mr. Hisney. So that store was eventually sold to Anthony and Augustine Melkovitz. And in 1963, I know that they were open as late, I believe in the 70s, if I'm not mistaken. But we have the last store in operation as Minnie's, which is where we get the title of our presentation. Because above the sign of her store, it has that same slogan that I cannot pronounce with my southern slang, but it basically says Minnie's Slovak, the friendly people of Slovaktown. And there were a number of articles talking about the gathering places and the things and just the community there in Slovak. Just quickly on the schools, we had the first school was Wiley School, which is a one-room school about a mile west of Slovak. It moved and it became the new Wiley School before we had an official one-room public school in Slovak, and that was built in 1909. We know it closed in the late 30s to early 40s when the majority of those students went to the Hazen schools. But in the midst of that, that one-room school had been taught also by the Catholic nuns in the community. And somewhere in the 30s, something happened. People disagreed on something. And so the Catholic families withdrew their children from the public school and they built their own school. Oh, sorry, missed a slide. This is an article that ran on the Slovak News and the Grand Prairie News in December of 1924. And it talks about the importance of them having the American flag raised for the very first time. So the irony did not escape me that these people have they've fled their home country. They've created a new home in the United States, and now they are proud Americans and emotionally touched by the opportunity to raise that flag over their school. I love the quote. It says, following this, Reverend Father Hagney addressed the children of the people. In simple terms, he explained that our flag stands for liberty and justice to all, was the way it was translated. And I just think that that says a lot about what they've come through and what they've accomplished in the time they've been here. But here's a picture of the Catholic school that was there. And we know that that school was built in 36, originally started in the parish hall, as many church schools still today. Built in 36 and was operating until 61 when the last student. And as I've been told by one of our board members, he thinks it may have been his fault that the school closed down. So, but just a final little taste of Slovak life. And these are just some interesting tidbits that I found in my research. We take our laws seriously. There is to be no hunting on the Sabbath. So we have an arrest warrant in 1922. A gentleman named Joe Urin had Will Hall arrested for hunting on the Sabbath. And there was another law by which physical assault carried a $1 fine, but verbal assault carried a $5 fine. Yeah, sticks and stones carry some penalties there. But I will close my portion with this. This is a quote I also took out of the immigrants document that was written by the government. It says the Slovaks of the community are practically an independent group. Their recreation and amusements are their own. Their neighborly visiting seems to be almost the only form of enjoyment indulged in, although the younger people occasionally have dances among themselves. And I couldn't help but think about that Friday as I was finishing this up, and I was thinking about Slovak Heritage Day. And I was thinking, that is still true. Their form of enjoyment is in each other. And with that, I think back to the original quote where they were looking to form these colonies in unity. And so I think that that's kind of what sums up Slovak to me.